Good morning. Welcome to Brookings. I'm Don Cohn and senior fellow here at Brookings. The germ for these papers was hatched or planted, I guess, or seed. I guess the seed was planted. Maybe that's the best metaphor. In the spring of 2017, David Wessel and I were having a conversation, and we thought it was a good time to take stock of what we knew or thought we knew about the efficacy of unconventional monetary policies at central banks that had been used since the central banks hit the zero lower bound in the fall-winter of 2008. The asset purchases, strong forward guidance, negative interest rates, et cetera. It was a good time for the U.S. because the U.S. had actually begun normalization of policies, so unconventional policies were being phased out. Portfolio additions had stopped, interest rates were rising in the spring of 2017, and the Fed was saying that if when rates got up a little higher, then portfolios would begin to run off. Global growth was good, and that implied that maybe the UK and the ECB and maybe at some point even Japan might be able to stop their unconventional monetary policy. So it was a good time to take stock of what we had learned in the previous 9 years. There were lots of studies of various aspects of unconventional monetary policy with disparate results, and we wondered whether we could find somehow a consensus of what worked and what didn't work and why it worked. So were the policies successful in changing financial conditions in the market? Were the financial conditions, how did they affect the economy? Did they boost the economy to achieve inflation and employment goals? And what channels did these things work through? What could we say about the costs and the cost side of unconventional monetary policies? Seemed pretty evident that the inflation risks that some people worried about when they were being put in place wasn't a real cost. And the Fed was exiting, so concerns about exit didn't seem to be really high, but we needed to review that, and there are the potential financial stability concerns with the unwinding. So what can we say about costs? I think we'll hear today that how effective these policies are and what channels they work through aren't yet completely settled issues, but we hope by this project we've moved the discussion along. The conversation with David also occurred in the context of returning from a conference at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco when we were having this conversation. The conversation happens many times in the U.S. There's secular stagnation, persistently low interest rates and low equilibrium rates, resulting in concerns about is there enough scope for monetary policy after a recessionary shock, to move the economy back to full employment and achieve the 2% inflation target. And we thought that before really undertaking an alteration of a well understood and accepted inflation target, maybe we ought to assess whether combined conventional and unconventional policies, especially as those unconventional policies had come to be refined over the slow growth period, would be sufficient to achieve inflation and output objectives in a timely way without changing the basic structure and strategy of policy, changing the 2% inflation target or going to a price level target, et cetera. Now, we had in mind a project or some articles that future policymakers could refer to if ever they were in the same situation we found ourselves in the fall, in December of 2008. To be most useful, these articles should be accessible to interested, informed policymakers who weren't necessarily technically trained economists, and also useful to people in the Congress, senators and representatives and their staffs, who are also interested and informed and who oversee the Fed and help shape public discussions of Fed policy. And that led us to seek the partnership of the Journal of Economic Perspectives, These articles will be out shortly in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, and we thank Tim Taylor and the other editors who helped to focus and shape the contributions. We were also struck that much of the literature about unconventional monetary policies originated within the central banks. That's where most of the expertise on monetary policy is, but the credibility of any article that might summarize what we thought we knew or didn't know would be enhanced by having authors not so closely associated with policies or invested in their success. And that led us to Ken Kuttner from Williams College for the assessment of unconventional monetary policy in the U.S., and to a number of people at the IMF, Giovanni Dell'Ariccia, Pau Rabanal, Damiano Sandri of the IMF for unconventional policy in the Euro area, Japan, and the UK. Each paper will be presented by the author, followed by comments from two knowledgeable observers, and then a panel discussion and questions from the audience. Ken will present the first paper with comments by Anna Cieslak and Ken West. Louise Shiner of Hutchins Brookings will moderate the discussion. Damiano will present the second paper with comments by Ben Broadbent and Angel Obidi. Stephanie Kerr-Suru of the Federal Reserve will moderate that discussion. Ken, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Don. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks also to the Hutchins Center for organizing this event, which is bound to generate some very interesting discussions this morning. So, time is short. I'm going to jump right into the topic, unconventional monetary policy in the U.S. Most people here probably already know the overarching goal of unconventional policy in the U.S. was to try to lower long-term interest rates, private sector interest rates, increase the availability of intermediate credit, and the unconventional policy consisted of really two prongs, as I'm sure you know. The first prong was something I'm calling quantitative easing. When you talk about quantitative easing, we're talking about 3 asset purchase programs, the LSAPs plus the maturity extension program, or MEP. So my chart here shows, you've probably all seen some version of this chart at some point. This shows the central bank, the Fed's balance sheet, and the thing that I want to bring out from this chart is that the 4 different policies were rather heterogeneous in their nature. So LSAP 1 and LSAP 3, you see on the chart, involved large increases in the volume of mortgage-backed securities held by the Fed, which is a very novel policy. LSAP 2, or I should say the maturity extension program in particular, involved a very major substitution from short and intermediate term bonds to longer term bonds. So, and then the second prong of unconventional policy was forward guidance. Forward guidance, of course, consisted of statements intended to reduce expectations of long-term interest rates, of short-term interest rates, and by doing so, decrease long-term interest rates. Now, it's worth pointing out that the Fed had already been engaging in some kind of a weak form of forward guidance for some years. So, for example, forward guidance was a statement from 2006 stated that the committee judges that some further policy firming may be needed to keep the risks of inflation and output on track, in balance. Well, the forward guidance policy was kind of in the same spirit, but just more concrete in terms of what it said about future interest rates. So, for example, the December 18 statement in 2008 spoke of keeping the funds rate low for some time. They got a little bit bolder in 2009, referring to a low period of very low interest rates for an extended period. Beginning in 2011, they went to calendar-based statements, such as exceptionally low levels of interest rate for at least through mid-2013. And then in 2012, they went to a very explicit statements about the level of interest rates contingent on economic conditions, so at least as long as the unemployment rate remains above 6.5%. So let me just take a moment to mention what unconventional policy was not. When I talk about unconventional policy, I'm going to exclude things like the alphabet soup of various emergency lending programs, commercial paper funding facility, TAF, and all that stuff. I've lost track of all the abbreviations. And it's also quite different from the quantitative easing policy practiced by the Bank of Japan. To recall the difference between what the Fed was doing, what the Bank of Japan was doing. The Bank of Japan was focused primarily on bank reserves, which they like to call current account balances confusingly, whereas the Federal Reserve was really focused more on the asset side of the balance sheet, emphasizing the quantities and the nature, the characteristics of the assets being purchased. So did it work? That's the central question here today. Did unconventional policy stimulate spending and speed the recovery? It's actually not an easy question to answer, which is, I guess, partly the reason why we're here. So the fundamental problem in assessing the impact of unconventional policy, indeed any kind of a policy, is that we really don't observe anything you might think of as a controlled experiment. So therefore, it's hard to identify a causal effect of these policies. So a skeptic would say, well, gee, interest rates fell after quantitative easing and forward guidance, but maybe they would have fallen anyway, given the weak economy. Or the skeptic might say the economy continued to contract despite quantitative easing and forward guidance. Therefore, the policies were ineffective. Or might even say the economy eventually recovered, but maybe would have done so on its own, even in the absence of these policies. So the trick in terms of identifying the policies is to find some kind of a sort of an exogenous movement of the policy one might use to identify some causal effect, which is very difficult. Some additional complications arise in the context of unconventional policy. Well, first, there's the relatively short track record, about 7 years all told, which really is not even a full business cycle. In comparison, when economists look at the impact of conventional policy, they're drawing on a 4 or 5 decade experience with interest rate policy, and even then, there's still some debate and some uncertainty about the effects of conventional interest rate policy. Second, the quantitative easing, at least, relied on kind of a poorly understood, maybe that's too strong a word, or maybe an under-researched transmission mechanism, namely the portfolio balance effects, which I think were sort of abandoned as a thing research-wise back in the 1970s, and then they came back into vogue, sort of, and the Fed and other researchers kind of had to reinvent or rediscover that aspect of the transmission mechanism. Third, as mentioned previously, the policies were rather heterogeneous in terms of the asset mix being purchased, the type of assets, and of course, for guidance, nothing like that had really ever happened before. And so it became a challenge for researchers to really come up with a summary measure of the stance of monetary policy, so to speak, that one could then assess the impact of. And then finally, of course, lots of other things were happening at the same time. Of course, lots of other things are always happening at the same time, but this is particularly acute in this point. Economists are always, in order to assess the impacts of any policy, economists are typically looking at how deviations of policy from the normal course of policy would move, or shocks, as in the jargon, would move the economy away from its normal trajectory. Well, things were so different in 2008 that it's really hard to know what normal would have been in that context, and hence hard to know exactly what a shock to monetary policy would have been. Well, so having explained why discerning unconventional policies' effects is so difficult, I'll move on to a very brief summary of some of the research that's out there. As Don mentioned, there's been a ton of work and countless papers, more being written every day, so already my survey is going to be a little bit out of date. But I think it's useful to start with something of a taxonomy about the kinds of research that's been done on the topic. So in one bin, I put the studies that look at the impact on interest rates. And so this is relatively straightforward to do, although there are some issues. And there are two kinds of studies that fall into that bin. One are what I call event studies, and the other is what I call econometric term structure models. Another bin of research is studies that look at the effects on the real economy. This is a little bit trickier, or a lot trickier. And there are two types of research in this category. One would be studies that are sort of macro level. They look at macro effects, typically using an aggregate macro model. And then there's some interesting research using microdata, micro level studies on the differential impact across different firms or banks. So quickly, event studies, a quick summary of what these are and what they have found. The basic idea of an event study is quite straightforward, of course. You look at the market's response to the announcements on the day of, or maybe in a very narrow window around the announcement of around the policy. This, of course, relies on the policy being unanticipated, because if the policy were anticipated, those effects would have been priced into the yields, priced into the stock prices, whatever, and so you wouldn't see an effect even if the policy were actually having an effect on the economy. So what I've shown here in the pink bars are the change in the 10-year Treasury rate on various key announcement dates for quantitative easing. These are my calculations, but they're virtually identical to the ones that are out there in the literature. And as you can see, the first section of the chart shows the impact of the LSAP 1 announcements, and as you can see, 4 of the 4 of the first 5 announcements resulted in very large negative impacts on the 10-year Treasury yield. In fact, if you add up all those effects, however many there are, you come up to about 100 basis points, a full percentage point reduction in the 10-year Treasury rate. But what one sees is the announcements associated with subsequent programs are somewhat smaller. Again, this may be because those programs are less effective in terms of lowering interest rates, or it may simply be that those policies were more widely anticipated than the announcements associated with the first LSAP. And then another twist in terms of assessing the impact of the quantitative easing policies is that many of this, or at least a few of the quantitative easing announcements came on the same day, the same FOMC statements as key forward guidance announcements. So it becomes a little bit tricky to disentangle the effects of forward guidance versus quantitative easing. There have been efforts to do so, but I don't have time to summarize those. So a few other caveats having to do with event studies. One, some of the early LSAPs took place in times of market turbulence, and so some of the effects one sees from the first LSAP could have been a result of improving market functioning. Second, to the extent that the announcements were anticipated, as previously mentioned, the observed responses from the event studies would tend to understate their effects. But at the same time, I think there are real concerns about the event study evidence because they don't really tell us much about the persistence of the effects. Did they dissipate after a few days, after a couple of weeks? We really don't know for sure. And obviously, if they were less persistent, then that would have a smaller macroeconomic impact. Well, another approach involves what I'm calling economic term structure modeling. And okay, this is a pretty complicated but rigorous but rather opaque way of assessing the impact of changes in quantities on the asset prices and bond yields. Not enough time to go into that. But the bottom line is really trying to affect the impacts of the prices on the quantities on the prices, and in doing so, imposing some economic structure on the model and separating out the advantages. It separates out the expected interest rate effects from the term structure effects, which allows for the separate identification of those portfolio balance effects that I mentioned earlier. And the advantage relative to the event study evidence is it doesn't rely on the markets being surprised. These will work even if markets fully anticipate those announcements. Ballpark estimates for this kind of study come out to be about 40 to 50 basis points for the LSAPs and about 20 basis points for the maturity extension program. Pretty respectable reductions in the interest rate. Mostly, but not entirely, this came through reductions in the term premium with some marginal effect on expectations. And I have a nice chart here, which I don't have time to show because I'm running low on time. So we get to the really, I think the important question here is whether unconventional policy had any real effects. Measuring the effect on interest rates is relatively straightforward, a bit tricky, but this is much harder. One way to do it involves feeding the interest rate reductions that come out of these other models, particularly the term structure models, into a macro model and see what comes out in the other end. A couple of studies that do this have come up with an estimate in the range of about 1 percentage point on inflation, pretty respectable, with some lag. There's also a set of studies that use, very interesting studies that rely on microdata methods. The insight is that these policies would be expected to affect different firms or different banks differentially, depending on their characteristics, depending on their initial conditions. I'll just mention a couple of sets of studies. One found that firms with more reliance on long-term debt tended to respond more favorably, tend to be benefited from the maturity extension program, which recall was explicitly designed to reduce long-term interest rates relative to short-term interest rates, relative to those firms that relied more on short-term debt. Good circumstantial evidence in favor of the effects of maturity extension program. Another trio, I think, of studies at least looked at the bank's exposures to mortgage-backed securities that found that those with a greater exposure to mortgage-backed securities tended to benefit more from the first and third LSAPs, which, to recall, were primarily focused on purchases of mortgage-backed securities. The issue with these micro-based studies is they don't really tell you much about the aggregate effects. They're kind of strong circumstantial evidence that the policy has had an effect. It's hard to aggregate them up and say, okay, the bottom line effect on the macroeconomy was whatever. What about costs? What about the unintended consequences? Well, one, as Don mentioned, is inflation. I think we can really dismiss that out of hand without giving it a second thought. I think a more serious concern is that these policies resulted in adverse or disruptive spillovers to other economies, particularly to emerging markets. But a couple of points need to be made here. This is, one is that these are not unique to unconventional policy. These are true of any monetary policy, low interest rate, expansionary or contractionary. I haven't seen any evidence indicating that there's anything unusual about quantitative easing. And secondly, these effects are certainly preferable to a more protracted US recession, which would have been highly damaging to many other economies. A less easily dismissed concern is the concern about excessive risk-taking, and the difficulty here, I think, is defining what constitutes excessive. During a period of financial crisis, financial market disruption, we saw a lot of flight to quality, with investors being very unwilling to take on any kind of a risk. And in that context, a little encouragement to take some additional risk might actually have had some positive effects. Wouldn't be such a bad thing. In any case, this is an environment where a little bit of additional risk at a micro level, to the extent that it contributed to economic recovery, would have had a beneficial aggregate effect. So, should the Fed use unconventional policy next time? Well, to summarize, one part of the question is whether it worked. And I think, the evidence is such that it will never really rise to the beyond a reasonable doubt level. That may be unrealistic to ask, given the limitations of the studies and the short sample period. But I think by the preponderance evidence standards, the answer is clearly yes, at least to some extent. What about the costs? I haven't seen anything that would indicate the costs were major, although there is some legitimate concern about a too low for long environment. But I should point out that this is not specifically a function of unconventional policy, so much as it is a function of the Fed's interest rate decisions in recent years. So finally, bottom line, why not?
All right, thank you very much for having me here. Let me just start by saying this is an excellent summary of UMPs during the crisis and after the crisis, and it will become a staple reference certainly for my students. I will comment on something that Ken didn't have much time to talk about, that is the communication of those policies. And in particular, I will ask, what is the main piece of news that financial markets gleaned from unconventional monetary policy announcements? So for a while, it has been understood that news coming out at communication events by central banks is not one-dimensional. On top of revealing their actions, policymakers also tell us about the path of their actions. And these are the words that are contained in the statement. So the simple graph is showing you the wordiness of statements released by the Fed, starting from the summer of 2007 through the taper tantrum. They were clearly talking more, or you guys were talking more, and they kept talking even more in the period from mid-2013. Now, what are these words conveying in terms of news? So people came up with at least two other channels on top of this being news about monetary policy. It could be news about the fundamental growth expectations, and it could be news that affects risk premium. And this is one of the main challenges, at least for event study types of investigations, to resolve. Okay? Many of the papers that Ken summarized, most of them, actually focus on univariate responses of asset prices around communication events. And I will argue that to sort out which type of news came out during communication events, it is actually useful to look at bivariate response of asset prices. And in particular, I will study the co-movement of stocks and yields across the entire maturity structure to sort out the question about the types of news. So when you think about a very simple framework in which you have three structural shocks, a standard conventional monetary policy shock that moves short rate expectations, what it should do is it should induce negative co-movement between stocks and yields, as Ken and Bernanke have documented in their work, and many subsequent papers did so as well. So you should see negative co-movement upon a monetary shock that weakens with the maturity of the interest rate. In terms of growth
and if you use the mic, people who are watching online.
Oh, that's new to me, but okay. So in terms of other types of news, if you have a risk premium shock or growth news being revealed by communication, in general, under relatively simple conditions, they will generate positive co-movement between stocks and yields, but the maturity pattern will be different. Growth news will affect more the short end of the term structure or intermediate range of the term structure maturities, and risk premium shock through the duration effects should affect more the long end. So using this very simple intuition from a stylized macrofinance model, in some recent work with Andreas Schrimp of BIS, we propose to classify news coming out at central bank communication events in a four-way matrix by whether the co-movement between stocks and yields is positive or negative, and which part of the term structure is moving more. So the two left columns are non-monetary news, being growth news or shocks to risk premium. On the right-hand side, you have a conventional monetary policy shock inducing negative co-movement of stocks and yields, but more so at the short end, and the unconventional monetary policy shock that will move more the long end of the term structure than the short end, negatively with the stock market. So here are some examples of what term structures of realized covariances between stocks and yields look like over time. Let's look at the middle panel. In the middle panel, I am plotting realized covariances in an event window, and each bar is showing you the realized co-movement at high frequency between stocks and yields of different maturity. This looks very much like a monetary policy shock where the stocks, where there was a negative co-movement, like in Ken's work, but this co-movement declined in maturity, very much like a conventional shock to monetary policy expectations. On the right-hand side, you see an event where actually you see a positive co-movement between stocks and yields that is highest in the intermediate range of maturities and declines with maturity. On that particular event, it seems that the important piece of news was Fed's update to growth expectations. And this seems to be the driving shock here. On the left-hand side, you see actually that these announcements can be multidimensional, at the same time conveying monetary news, moving the short end, and risk premium news, moving the long end and in the positive direction with yields and stocks. We have known that central bank pronouncements can have dramatic effects on asset prices through the risk premium channel, and probably the closest example of this happening is Draghi's whatever it takes speech. The short end of the term structure barely changed, but the long end of the term structure moved dramatically. And in particular, this seems to have been a major risk-on event when safe assets, long-term treasury bonds in Germany lost, yields went up, and the stock market and risky assets rallied. Okay? So this would be classified through the lens of the framework that I laid out as a risk premium shock. Now, let's look at co-movement between stocks and yields over time. So I am plotting covariances, realized covariances in a narrow event window between stocks and the 5-year yield changes, stock returns and 5-year yield changes. And consistent with Bernanke and Kuttner, most of the time, the co-movement is negative. But when you look at the period from the summer of 2007 through the taper tantrum, you see a lot of heterogeneity in terms of signs, suggesting that part of these movements were actually dominated by the non-monetary policy component. That is, news that didn't just drive short rate expectations, but revealed to the public something about growth and risk premium. Now we can zoom in this graph on just UMP announcements. So 3 takes away for looking at the co-movement of stocks and yields around particular UMP programs. First observation, before 2013, which is the vertical line in the plot, these policies were dominated by positive co-movement between stocks and yields, suggesting non-monetary policy news content. However, if there was a forward guidance component, the co-movement suggested strong monetary news component, okay? The third observation from the graph is that after Bernanke's taper tantrum in mid-2013, generally policies related to tapering and exit from easy policies were associated with negative co-movements suggestive of dominant news on dominant component of monetary shocks. Now, what we obviously want to do is to understand which fraction of variation in asset prices has been dominated by a particular type of news. Put it in terms of a simple equation, we observe asset prices, yield changes, stock returns around central bank announcements. We want to convert the information in asset prices into shocks that have structural interpretation, to be able to say which type of news contributed what amount to the observed variation in asset prices. This can be done. So using intuition from structural VARs, we can rotate observed variation in asset prices into structural shocks. And I will apply this intuition just to looking at scheduled FOMC announcement within a very narrow window of when the announcement happened. So let's see what the contributions of the different shocks have been over time to yields and stock market returns at scheduled announcements. The bottom panel, the little table, is showing you which fraction of variance in asset prices stemmed from a particular type of news. So the first line is telling you that the 2-year yield moved roughly half and half in response to growth news being reviewed, so growth expectations updates being induced by central bank announcement, by Fed announcements, and the other half stems from short rate expectations updates, okay? Standard monetary policy news channel. The second row is telling you that the 10-year yield was dominantly moving because of the term premium adjustments. The final row is telling you that equities have been moving around because of the risk-free discount rate news. Okay? Now, looking at the trajectories in the upper panels, you see how the contributions of those various shocks have been evolving. So on the left panel, you see that monetary news were pushing 2-year yields up, but growth news started pushing 2-year yield, were pushing down, but growth news were pushing 2-year yields up, starting from around 2013. In terms of equities, what is striking is the very strong effect in terms of increasing equity values stemming from the risk-free component of the discount rate, or expectations thereof, okay? Consistent with the Fed's desire to generate sort of wealth effects. So let me conclude. Probably most of us would agree that the importance of communication has increased in unconventional monetary policy times. It seems that unconventional policy announcement had an important component of non-monetary news. And we have found that this non-monetary news component essentially increases the more central banks talk. I would like to leave you with 2 questions, perhaps for the later discussion. Is what markets heard actually consistent with what the Fed said and wanted the markets to hear? That's the first question. And the second question, a lot of our work has been empirical. The open question to me, at least, is what is the optimal design of central bank communication in those times? Thank you.
Well, thanks. I'm happy to be here. I thought this was a great paper. And like Anna, I will say, well, recommend it to all my students. Recommend it to all of you. It's got great information in it for both insiders and people who are new to the topic. The talking to Ken beforehand, he said he tried to present a fair and balanced view of quantitative easing. I would say that in contrast to the use of that phrase in some corners outside of this room, I think it really was fair and balanced. I am probably towards the skeptical rather than enthusiastic side about the efficacy of the Fed's programs, but I fall within the range of things that, range of views that Ken acknowledged in his talk, in his paper. So what I plan to do is actually, Ken was so careful to acknowledge all points of view, I found difficult to find something to disagree with, but I did find 2 sentences I disagreed with. Shockingly, in his 15-minute talk, he didn't have a chance to even bring them up. I don't understand why he couldn't say everything he said in the paper in his 15 minutes. So let me work my way towards those 2 sentences of disagreement. So first, a potted summary of the paper. He thinks unconventional monetary policy worked, though there's ambiguity about the magnitude and the persistence of its effects. Ken mentioned persistence in his talk, and I'm going to come back to that, so note the word persistence there. There's considerable ambiguity as to the extent to which it worked through adjusting relative asset supplies, through portfolio rebalancing, and the extent to which it worked through forward guidance. And he concludes that in any future use of unconventional monetary policy, we should conduct it in a rule-like way. I would agree with that. We should use both forward guidance and asset purchases. I would agree with that. He wishes we were in another world where the Fed could do things it's not allowed to do, perhaps. And finally, the 2 sentences that I disagree with, as he said, even if we're away from the zero lower bound, why not use unconventional monetary policy along with our usual targeting of short-term interest rates? So I agree the evidence on quantitative easing is mixed and ambiguous. I agree it probably had positive effects. I'll lead you up to explaining why I am towards the skeptical side on unconventional monetary policy. Again, I think it works, but I'm just not as enthusiastic a believer in that view as others. But I'm skeptical enough that I'm doubtful that one should be using it as a monetary policy tool in normal times. All right, so this is a graph from a paper that I co-authored with David Greenlaw, Ethan Harris, and Jim Hamilton, entitled A Skeptical View of the Impact of the Fed's Balance Sheet. So when you see Exhibit 4.1, it's not 4.1 in the paper under discussion, it's 4.1 in my paper. So a 2-scale graph, and on the right side, the scale is interest rates, and the line going down there is 10-year yield. The right scale is the amount of Fed securities held outright, and you saw that same line in Ken's picture, though he had a nice, pretty red color underneath it. And what are the shaded areas? The shaded areas are periods in which the Fed was increasing its holdings of securities outright during any of QE1, QE2, QE3. This is not quite the actual periods of QE1, QE2, QE3. If you can see the scale there, there's an 09, and the shaded area for QE1 starts in 09 because the Fed started purchasing securities in January of 2009. QE1 actually started end of November, so it's not quite QE1 itself, it's the period of purchases. What I want you to notice there is the 10-year yield was higher at the end of each of these purchase periods than it was at the beginning. So quantitative easing is supposed to say when we bring things onto our balance sheet, interest rates fall. Interest rates did fall overall, mostly in the periods between quantitative easing, including, by the way, in the period of the maturity extension program, which isn't shadowed there. All right, so does this say that buying assets increases our interest rates? So of course not. I always think I'm talking to a room full of professors. We professors, spend a lifetime saying correlation isn't causation, so this graph does not mean when the Fed buys assets it drove up interest rates, self-evidently. In the particular context of quantitative easing, I mean, I've mixed here purchases of mortgage-backed securities, agency debt, and treasury debt. So a lot of things going on here. But I would ask you to keep in mind when you have thinking about the success of the Fed's programs, to bear in mind at the end of the purchase periods for QE1, QE2, and QE3, 10-year yields were higher at the end than they were at the beginning. So as Ken said, we got to figure out some way to identify something causal. I'm going to talk about the effect on 10-year yields. I'm going to talk about one of the two things that Ken mentioned, the event studies. As a preliminary to that, there's a little bit of stuff that Ken didn't talk about, which has to do with regression studies. My reading of that literature, like Ken's, is there's little persistence from Fed actions. So just put that on the record, and then talk about the event studies. I want to say that event study evidence should be interpreted cautiously, that when we get this 100 basis point effect, for example, in QE1 that Ken mentioned, which as he said is standard, it's not quite clear that those 100 basis points is a meaningful 100 basis points in the sense of persistence of the effects. And I'm not sure I'll be able to get to the second bullet point, but perhaps. All right, so first of all, unambiguously, this announcement, the event study literature, announcement effects, they identify an effect on 10-year yields. So I am not going to dispute that. Unambiguously. The March 2009 announcement extending QE1, within 30 minutes of the Fed announcements, 10-year yields fell 44 basis points. There's nothing else that could have made them fall. Of course, it was the Fed announcement. Of course. No doubt about that. However, if we think the way monetary policy works is the central bank lowers interest rates on government lending or influences them, that lowers private lending rates, that stimulates the economy, we would want any impact on interest rates to be persistent and sustained. This particular one was not so persistent and sustained. Pointer seems not to work, but some of the jig-jags you see in that rising 10-year yields during QE1 are these numbers I have on the overhead. So one explanation for this is, absent the Fed doing this, everything that followed would have been 44 basis points higher. Another possibility is maybe the event study literature, despite its good intentions, doesn't quite capture the sustained impact of an announcement like this. So my example here actually comes from this Wolfers and Zitzowitz AER paper, which Jim Hamilton also used in a comment on quantitative easing, is step outside of monetary policy, take the election in 2016. After it became apparent that Trump was going to win, equity futures fell 5%, which is a big amount, by the way. Standard deviation of movement on the stock market is about 1% on a daily basis. By noon, that had all come back. Now, an event study over a narrow window would say Trump's election caused the stock market to fall by 5%. What happened between the election and noon the next day? Kind of nothing. I mean, the market was digesting the news, I would say. Similarly, with the Fed 50 basis point effect there on March 18th, arguably what happened was the Fed digested the news, the market digested the news. In the end, interest rates were essentially back where they were started from. Yeah, so I'm going to have to skip most of this. Don Cohn said we're not doing quantitative easing anymore. I thought the Fed was doing quantitative diseasing. They're selling off their securities. So if you think there's this portfolio balance effect, it should still be working its way along. It doesn't seem to affect the markets. I mean, people are kind of ignoring what's going on. All right, so let me end here. I think unconventional monetary policy worked. I'm not sure it worked as effectively as some people argue. So I would say if there's a zero lower bound, by all means use it. But if not, stay away from it. We really know how things work with the short-term interest rate. Let's stick with that and stay away from quantitative easing when you're away from the zero lower bound.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Well, thank you all for like really, really interesting and informative presentations. I'm sure that we have a lot to talk about. Let me start with kind of where you were, Ken, at the end, which is just asking these questions about event studies and how to think about using something like an event study to figure out whether something like QE works. Is it a little funny to know that the central bankers who are doing QE aren't sure if it works and they look to the stock market to decide, especially at the beginning of something new? Like, why is it that they understand better than we do whether or not QE is going to work for the economy? Anybody? Like,
Which Ken was that addressed to?
oh, well, I was saying I was starting with the stock market and the Trump effect, but why don't you start by answering that question? And I'm interested in anybody's comments.
Let's see. So there's a little.
Yeah, the little mouth.
The little mouth.
Yeah.
Oh, the little mouth. Okay. Great. All right. So I've got the little mouth on here, I think, and the red light means that. Can you hear me? Okay. Great. No, that's an interesting point, Louise, and I think it's good that you bring that up. And this is a time that I wasn't there at the Fed. I had left the Fed long before, but it is a kind of an awkward situation where you're, as you say, looking to the markets to determine whether the policy is effective. But I think I think Anna's presentation was spot on in terms of I'm perfectly happy to agree with Anna's point that the markets are able to kind of figure out what these effects are going to be on yields, with the caveat that this is something. One of the issues with the policies is that these are really things that had never been seen before, and so the markets are figuring out just like the Fed was figuring it out.
I would like to add to this that we have growing evidence that tells us that markets respond not just to what we would believe is a traditional monetary shock, but also some other information that is revealed by central banks. And I think the empirical evidence on this is pretty strong. Now, the mechanism that underlies it, I do think is we are still a little bit in the dark about. When I talk to Fed people, they tell me that they are adamant that they don't actually have more information about the economy than the private sector does. So what is that the Fed is releasing to the public? Some different information that actually makes the public update their expectations about the economic outlook is, I think, an interesting question.
Let me just jump in after that. That was, I think, what Anna's referring to is the difference that the distinction people have some have made between Delphic and Odyssean forward guidance. You didn't mention those terms in your presentation, but that's exactly what you're talking about. I actually did have one more slide, which I didn't get a chance to. And the final bullet point in my last slide actually ties in quite nicely to what you said, which is the communication strategy for this kind of policy becomes really critically important, and I'm not sure exactly how to do it. And I agree with you. There were some announcements, and I think Giustiniano and Evans, the one I'm talking, and it was a Brookings paper, so you all know it. Very legitimately made the point that there were these information effects. So the communication that one would have to craft to accompany that, to convince the markets that the Fed wasn't, by conducting expansionary policy, wasn't telling the markets that things were actually worse than people thought. That's a tough challenge. I think that's going to be a challenge, but it's not to say that's a challenge unique to unconventional monetary policy. I think it's a challenge for any Fed policy communication strategy.
Let's talk a little bit more. I got to turn on. Let's talk a little bit more about the question of persistence. Right, because that seems to be sort of so everybody agrees that on the day there was a reaction, right, by the markets that we know. So that's the empirical evidence quite clear. They were reacting. They thought they were hearing something. How do you feel about the evidence that shows that these things weren't necessarily that persistent? And I guess I was thinking it was just the event study, but you said also the term premium regression stuff also shows lack of persistence.
Regression studies, yes. I'll let Ken.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I did in the process of preparing this paper was I also came in with, I hope you can tell, with kind of a skeptical viewpoint. And one of the things I did was to say, well, I did some of my own regression analysis to try to figure out, well, how much of these if we look at a longer window, or if we look at a period of time, not just measured in 1 day or 2 days, but over like even a week. I did find that that some of these announcements actually did have highly persistent effects, and they could measure them at even as long as 2 weeks. Again, I think a couple of those announcements were the really big reactions associated with the first LSAP. And you might say, well, okay, so the really persistent effects there may have been traceable to things other than the reduction in the term premium, the restoration of market functioning, or whatever. But I think some of these things are so huge. I mean, comparable to the 5% drop in the stock market, and they didn't recover right away. Some of these effects you can see over a period measured in, as long as 10 days. That doesn't mean they're, at that point, the problem, Ken, as you know, is you lengthen the window, and a lot of other news comes in. And so it's like, well, okay, it goes away after a couple of weeks. Is that because the market is, overreacted and is coming back? Or it's just because a lot of other stuff is happening that's going to mess things up? And, that's the nature of event studies. You can't really, it's a trade-off between event window, shorter event window, you can get some of these overreactions. A longer event window, you can get other stuff going on that's kind of messing up the results. So it's a trade-off, and, I think that's, as I said, that's one of the inherent limitations of the event study method.
So is a couple of weeks a long time?
It's long enough that you can ascribe it to market overreaction, a day of market overreaction, as in the Trump effect.
So I think the distinction in terms of persistence is closely linked to whether it was the term premium that moved or short rate expectations that moved. And it is true probably that all the effects that went through the term premium are not particularly persistent because term premium mean revert relatively quickly. However, we know that short rate expectations are incredibly persistent. So when the Fed, if the Fed is able to move short rate expectations, I would expect these effects to have these announcements to have a larger and more persistent effect.
So when we think about what you just said in terms of forward guidance versus asset purchases, is that like we all agree that forward guidance is that changes the market expectations of short rates works, right? And the question is much more on these asset purchases. Is that the right way to think about it? So that the asset, yeah, and therefore the asset purchases which are sort of intended to move the term premium are less likely to be persistent. Is that kind of what you're saying? How do you bring in the evidence, the micro evidence? That's sort of a different way of looking at it now, about certain firms or certain households and how they were affected. Does that is that have a lot of weight in your view that Kiwi worked, a little weight? And Ken, what do you think about that in light of your skepticism? Yeah, well, you're the skeptical one. And let's go this way.
So I think so I have a very traditional view of the way monetary policy works, which is it lowers monetary policy. When it wants to expand the economy, works by lowering nominal rates. Prices move slowly, so that lowers real rates. Falling real rates encourage spending. So I think the first step in the transmission, if the first step doesn't seem to be working, one should be skeptical about the ultimate final steps of that working, and kind of the burden of proof is higher. So I'm skeptical about this first step working very well. I think it worked somewhat, again. I'm not saying it didn't work, but I'm less enthusiastic, I think, than Ken, for example. So I'm a little skeptical about the first step. That makes me, a little more skeptical, all things equal, about the evidence about it working at the final step.
I think you make a good point, Ken. The one set of studies I was referring to, which I thought was actually quite nice, by some people at the board, didn't really rely as much on the interest rate channel as it did on what you might call the bank lending channel. And that's the one that said, well, you have some banks that have higher exposure to mortgage-backed securities. And so if you can take some of those mortgage-backed securities, which were a little bit iffy or perceived to be iffy at the time, if you take those off the balance sheets, then that could increase lending through by making, even apart from any effects it might have had on the interest rate. So, we didn't, I think part of the issue with the literature on this is that it's been so focused on the interest rate that it's tended to ignore some of the other channels of transmission, particularly through the financial system and through intermediation, which I think can't be discounted.
Okay, so obviously figuring out the effects of QE and unconventional monetary policy is incredibly difficult looking back to see whether or not it worked and what the counterfactual would have been. Now let's look forward a little bit. So you ended your slide with like, why not? Which is hardly a vote of confidence. So looking forward, I think, you read the literature and there are some people who think, look, you don't have to worry about the zero lower bound at all. We have these other tools. These other tools are just as effective. We can translate them by scaling them up. We can kind of get any effect that we want, and no worries about, low R star and having to change the framework because we have tools. What do you think? Each of you. So why don't you start, Ken Kuttner?
Why don't I start? Let's see. Well, Ken characterized my conclusion, which I didn't really have a time to get to, as enthusiastic. I wouldn't say I was terribly I wouldn't say maybe enthusiasm was an overstatement. I think the experience opens up some possibilities that are worth considering. So, for example, using balance sheet policy independent of interest rate policy. I wouldn't say that I think that's, the standard academic dodge is to say more research is necessary. But in this case, I think it's absolutely true. I think we have to think about what are the situations, for example, in which that might be an appropriate kind of a policy to make. I think my reading evidence is that kind of policy would be possible. Whether it be advisable depends on whether there was a well-defined objective, for example, a financial stability objective that kind of policy would further. In a non-zero bound, referring to the non-zero lower bound environment, in a zero lower bound environment, I'm going to echo something that Don has said on a number of occasions to me, and that is, essentially when you're talking about lowering interest rates, you're talking about sort of moving expenditure forward in time. And there may be some limits to how much that can be done. And so the interest rate effects, I think, might be somewhat more limited than, I'm not sure how far we can push those, but clearly we're able to push them farther than, maybe farther than a skeptic would have expected going into it.
I'm just ask a question. So this question about moving consumption forward, is that something specific to unconventional monetary policy, or that's just a question about any interest rate effect?
I think that's the question about really any interest rate effect. That's true. But to the extent that the scope for that becomes a little bit more limited when you're talking about unconventional policy, then I think it would become more binding.
Okay. Yeah, Anna.
Going forward, I guess I personally have two questions. So one question, we have spent a lot of time thinking about international spillovers on emerging economies and so on. But the general question is how did those policies affect market functioning, even in very liquid markets, in US treasuries and so on? What were the effects? I am not sure. I don't have an understanding of an answer to this question. That's my first question going forward. The second question is about inflation. So you end your paper saying inflation has certainly not been a worry. And I think this is true when it's essentially inflation driven by demand shocks and there is no trend inflation, bonds are very risky, we don't need to worry about inflation. But if we start to have persistent updates in inflation expectations, then we might get all issues related to the pricing of treasury bonds and financing of deficits and so on and so forth. So the question is, will we have any persistent shocks to trend inflation going forward?
Well, I said I thought there were two sentences in Ken's paper I disagree with. Maybe I misread them. Maybe we don't disagree at all. I thought you said you were supportive of using, LSAPs in normal times, but now you're saying maybe not. So I think in a zero lower bound situation, absolutely, LSAPs. My view is once we're away from there, no. We understand, or we think we understand, how monetary policy transmission works when the Fed is controlling a short-term interest rate. I think we're kind of very uncertain about how monetary policy works when we're using LSAPs. So I would say away from the zero lower bound, stay away.
So getting at. So, are we ready for the next recession? Should we think that we actually need to do something else besides thinking, well, we've got LSAPs in our back pocket, so we're okay? Should we worry enough that we need to change the monetary policy framework, raise the inflation target? How much confidence does the experience with unconventional monetary policy give you that says we're going to be okay? Sure, yeah.
I think if we could avoid the zero lower bound, it would be great. Whether that comes with some sort of price level targeting, raising the inflation target, I don't know. But I think we're all aware interest rate cuts usually add up to 3 or 4% traditionally when we're going into a recession. We're not even at the 3% and let alone the 4% level. So the next recession, we could end up back at the ZLB, and I think it would be great if we could avoid doing that.
No disagreement for me on that, Ken. Maybe a future conference would be one dedicated to raising the inflation target. That opens a whole other set of issues. But yeah, obviously, to the extent that we want to keep as far away from the zero lower bound as possible, subject to other policy considerations.
Great. Okay, I'm going to open up to the audience for questions. Raise your hands if you have a question. We have mics coming around. Do we have mics come up? Here, come up here. All right, and tell us who you are, please, and where you're from. I know
Hi, Bill English, Yale University. So I wanted to follow up on the persistence question. I guess I took some comfort from the kind of regression results and yield curve results like Lee and Wei in thinking they were showing persistent effects. Ken West suggested some suspicion, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And let's say we convinced ourselves persistence was a real problem. Well, can't the central bank then just peg out the yield curve? I mean, the Bank of Japan is pegging the 10-year JGB yield. So maybe it's a change in the way you do this, but not necessarily something that's terminal for that sort of policy.
The paper you mentioned, I can't comment on. I don't remember it well enough. I think we should worry about persistence, pegging the 10-year yield. Possibly, I guess. So I'm going to punt on that.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm just a member of the public, but it seemed to me in 2008, 2007, or whenever it was that quantitative easing was announced, the fear was runaway inflation would ensue. And yet it never has ensued. So, one, I'm wondering what will happen, but doesn't this just tell us that really all these economic theories that you had going into 2002 are wrong?
Well, that's kind of a big question.
Let's take the inflation.
Well, the impact, I think at least the consensus thinking nowadays is that the main driver of inflation is going to be sort of the level of slack in the economy and the degree of excess capacity. And to that extent, I think no one would gainsay the point that in 2008, 2009, into relatively recent period of time, there was a lot of slack in the economy. And even though the Fed had injected a lot of monetary base, the slack was keeping downward pressure on the price level. So that's conventional wisdom that I'm perfectly happy to accept. I think in that context, maybe the puzzle is, and this pertains to Japan too, is why inflation actually didn't fall more. Because there was so much slack in the economy. Take Japan, for example, very prolonged recession, only a very small amount of deflation. So if there is going to be a puzzle, I'd say the puzzle's in the opposite direction.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you, Roberto Perle, Kuttner Macro. So far we talked about the efficacy of these programs in the aggregate in their totality, right? But is there any evidence in your mind that the efficacy may have changed over time? Maybe changes with the level of the balance sheet, with the level of interest rates. Seems an important question if we want to address the prospective efficacy of these programs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think great question. I wish we knew the answer. The problem is it's hard enough to discern just the overall effect of unconventional monetary policy, to slice that more thinly and say, was it more effective during these 3 years versus these 3 years? That's asking a lot of the data. I just don't think we have enough information to be able to address that in a serious way.
question actually for Anna. So when you're looking at what the information was conveyed over time, does that tell you anything? I mean, so if at some point, if let's say part of the information is that people know the Fed's reaction function, once they know it, is that kind of, are you sort of done, or is that always something that you can continue doing?
Right, so I think the problem is with identifying the strength of the effects over time is that indeed markets learned about the reaction function, and then event studies do not resolve the issue of whether the subsequent programs were more or less effective. Just because we are looking at those narrow window where probably all the expectations were already adjusted. Now, in terms of what we have found, at least, is that through the period of the financial crisis, it is clear that communication by most big central banks like BOE, ECB, and the Fed were dominated by non-monetary news content. And starting from the tightening, in the tightening period, starting from around 2013, it was strong monetary content. So, but I cannot comment on the strength over time because it's an event study evidence.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And we'll move on to the international portion of our program.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to the Hutchins Center for hosting this event. Now, this is joint work with Giovanni Dell'Ariccia and Pau Rabanal, and the usual disclaimer applies. So these are our own views, not necessarily the ones of the IMF. Now, what we do in this paper is to provide an overview of unconventional monetary policies in the context of the euro area, Japan, and the United Kingdom. Now, let me start by giving you a little bit of background about the economic situation and the central bank response in these countries and regions. Well, as you can see on the left-hand side chart, first of all of these regions were severely affected by the global financial crisis, with GDP falling by between 6 and 7% within the first year of the crisis. Now, the central banks in the middle panel, you can see they lower policy rates quite sharply, all the way essentially to the zero lower bound. And then, as you can see in the right-hand side chart, they also engage in a broad range and varieties of unconventional monetary policies, which led to an expansion of the central bank balance sheets. Now, what we do in the paper is, first of all, to provide a sort of conceptual overview of a few key issues that we think are quite important as we are reliving the episodes of UMP in these countries. First of all, by thinking about what were the objectives of these policies, what were the channels of transmissions, and what were the possible side effects. Now, I'll be very brief for the sake of time because some of these points were already touched in the previous presentation by Ken and the discussion we had. But let me give you a few key takeaways from this. First of all, in terms of objectives, I think there were really sort of two parallel goals, which was especially clear in the context of the euro area. Now, the first goal was clearly to provide monetary accommodation once the zero lower bound was reached, so to find a way to deliver an increase in aggregate demand that ultimately would have fed into stronger growth and higher inflation. But at the same time, there was, again, especially in the context of the euro area, a joint objective, which was to provide support to the banking sector and to ensure monetary transmission across the peripheral countries in the euro area. So as we think about the experience of UMP, we think it's quite important to keep these two objectives in mind. Now, in terms of transmission channels, there are, of course, several avenues through which these kind of policies can impact the economy. We just emphasize a couple of those, which were already mentioned in the previous presentation. The first transmission channels works through the notion that there is some sort of market segmentation in financial markets, which is particularly acute during a financial crisis. What we mean by that is that there are some investors that have a preference towards some certain kinds of assets, for example, government bonds, so that when central banks steps into these markets by purchasing assets in large quantities, they can have an effect on prices, on yields, and this can transmit to the rest of the economy. A second important transmission channel is through a signaling device, a signaling effect. Now, that was quite obvious in the case of forward guidance, where the central banks, they aimed explicitly to provide some indications about the future stance of monetary policy, but signaling effects can also come through QE. Why is this so? Because they show the commitment of central banks to truly provide exceptional monetary accommodation for a prolonged period of time. Now, in terms of possible side effects, we're listing these four that we think were sort of probably paramount in people's minds, especially at the beginning of the crisis. The first one worked through concerns about bank profitability. The notion there was with QE and other measures by central banks that tend to compress term premia, this would essentially reduce the profitability of the banking sector, ultimately impairing the capitalization of the banking sector and possibly generating financial stability concerns. A second related notion was the fact that by lowering yields on safe securities on government bonds, the central banks were ultimately providing an incentive to financial institutions to look for higher yields by buying riskier securities. Now, to some extent, as discussed also before, this was an intended goal of policies, but there are also concerns that this may have been pushed too far, leading to excessive risk-taking and ultimately possibly even to a misallocation of resources in the economy. A third concern was the notion of a runaway inflation, the notion by increasing the monetary base so greatly with large quantitative easing programs, for example, this may have fed into very high inflation that the central bank would have been in a difficult position to contain. And fourth, we think there was also a prominent concern about the political economy aspects of central bank interventions. Here, the concern was that by showing how central banks can step into the economy going well beyond the traditional instrument of short-term policy rates, this may have raised a lot of political and public attention on central banks, also because of the risk that central banks, by buying risky securities, may eventually suffer losses, and ultimately, this may work as a threat to the independence of central banks. And we'll come back to this issue as we draw some key takeaways from the presentation. Now, with these notions in mind, let me move forward to provide you a brief overview of what was done and what were the effects across these three different regions. Now, let me start with the case of the euro area. And we think it's fair here to divide the experience of the ECB in three main periods. The first period was at the very beginning of the global financial crisis in 2008-2009. This was essentially a time where the ECB was focused mostly to providing liquidity to the banking sector through the LTRO program. So the scope of the intervention was relatively narrow, also because of a fear concern that the ECB really didn't have the mandate to start buying government bonds at that time. Now, things changed quite substantively at the peak of the euro area crisis between 2010 and 2012, where there were now concerns about the solvency of major countries in the euro area, including Spain and Italy. At that point, monetary policy really took a secondary goal as well, which was to backstop the sovereign debt crisis in the euro area, and especially to dispel fears of a possible breakup in the euro. The way in which that was accomplished was initially with a security market program, which was eventually complemented in 2012 by a prominent speech by President Draghi, where he made it very clear that the ECB was ready to do whatever it was necessary to keep the euro area together. That was also complemented with the launch of the outright monetary transaction program. And we think it's quite fair to say, and very visible in the data, that this commitment by the ECB was quite powerful in reducing yields on the sovereign bonds, especially of peripheral countries. And there are several research papers that have also documented a strong positive impact on GDP and inflation around that time. Now, finally, the ECB also engaged in unconventional monetary policies from 2013 onwards, unconventional monetary policies which had a little bit more of a conventional goal, which was primarily to support growth and bring inflation back to target. This was done with a combination of instruments, with forward guidance announcements, with the starting up of an asset purchase program, and also with the implementation of negative interest rates, so negative rates that were charged on bank reserves. And in our own work, we've documented how the initiation of negative interest rate period led essentially to a downward shift of yield curves throughout the euro area countries. Now, for what concerns instead the episode of the United Kingdom, the initial response to the crisis in 2009-2012 were very much in line with what the Fed did at that time. In particular, the Bank of England engaged in multiple rounds of QE. The first round of QE was very noticeably associated with a strong decline in yields, which, as in the case of the Fed, was essentially in the ballpark of 50 to 100 basis points. Now, there are interesting questions surrounding the subsequent rounds of QE, QE2 and QE3, because effects that seem to be somewhat weaker, raising concerns of whether there are decreasing returns from quantitative easing. On the other hand, though, we also need to keep in mind, as was already mentioned in the conversation before, that subsequent round of QE became more expected by markets, and so it is intrinsically more difficult to measure the impacts on financial markets and on yields. Now, the Bank of England also entered a second phase of unconventional monetary policy in 2013 and 14. This was mostly based on forward guidance announcement, essentially on the backdrop that inflation had been running above target for a prolonged period of time, and so there were thoughts in financial markets that the Bank of England was possibly close to start already a tightening cycle. Now, the Bank of England sort of pushed out these concerns about tightening monetary policy, and it did so with the forward guidance announcement, which interestingly used a quantitative target, where the Bank of England said we're not going to raise rates until unemployment is essentially at least below 7%. Now, this forward guidance announcement did not seem to have major impact on the level of yields, but it seemed to have provided more clarity to markets, because when you look at the short-term volatility in movements in expectation of short-term rates, they became more anchored, the volatility became smaller. Finally, the Bank of England also engaged in the fourth round of quantitative easing in 2016, and this was just for the goal of supporting economic growth on the backdrop of the Brexit vote. Now, finally, turning to the case of Japan, well, the response of the Bank of Japan to the early phase of the crisis was actually relatively weak. In 2010, 2012, what we saw was a few rounds of forward guidance announcement where the Bank of Japan essentially made it clear that they were not going to raise rates anytime soon, which didn't come as very unexpected news to the market, since Japan had been trapped in a long period of mild deflation and low rates to begin with. The Bank of Japan also engaged in some limited asset purchases. Now, these had a very small effects on yields and especially on inflation. To some extent, again, this is just a reflection that the yield curve in Japan was already quite low and flat to begin with, so there was limited scope for further changes in yields. But it also sort of revealed the fact that markets did not have very strong credibility about the commitment of the Bank of Japan to really bring inflation back to target, given that Japan had been coming out of a very prolonged period of mild deflation to begin with. Now, things changed quite substantially in 2013 and 14, when Mr. Abe campaigned on a platform of economic stimulus, which involved also very strong monetary accommodation. And when Mr. Abe became Prime Minister of Japan, essentially that gave the Bank of Japan the political backing to really switch gear and provide much more monetary stimulus in the economy. Now, this was done, first of all, with the introduction of now an explicit inflation target. It was also set to 2%, above from the 1% that people were sort of considering before. And also with the launch of the very large quantitative and qualitative easing program, which involved not only the open-ended purchase of government bonds, but also private riskier securities, among which, for example, even ETFs and real estate investment trust. Now, this kind of announcements and this kind of actions by the Bank of Japan did have a very visible effect on inflation, but unfortunately this effect was relatively short-lived, because after 1 year or two, inflation essentially came back down, hovering around zero. Thus showing that even when the central bank is extremely determined to provide monetary accommodation, and it has the political backing for doing so, it's still remarkably difficult to defeat the entrenched deflationary dynamics that were already present in Japan. This clearly calls central banks to take action early on, not to delay intervention until the point at which deflation is essentially a common phenomenon in the economy. Now, finally, in 2016, the Bank of Japan renewed its efforts to raise inflation, and it did so by also embracing negative interest rates, and then also mentioned before, by adopting a new monetary framework, which is called the yield curve control framework, whereby now the central bank actually announces not only short-term interest rate target, but also long-term interest rate target, and stands ready to intervene in the market to ensure that that rate essentially materializes in equilibrium. Now, thinking through these episodes, which really provide us a very great variety of UMP across 3 different countries, I think we're able to draw some key insights, which can hopefully be quite helpful to policymakers down the road. The first insight is that across these 3 countries, UMP, they did seem to provide monetary stimulus once the zero lower bound was reached. And especially in the euro area crisis, they also helped definitely to restore monetary transmission to the peripheral countries. Now, the effects are quite visible when you look at financial conditions. Again, there are very relevant questions about the persistence of these effects, which are not going to be easy to be identified. But at least in the short term, these effects were quite significant. And there are also analysis which looked at the effects on the real economy, output and inflation, and the general consensus is that there was positive effect on output and inflation. Again, it's a challenging question to answer, but in any case, we think that if we do take for granted that at least the effects on financial markets are significant, it's hard to believe that they do not have some positive spillover to the rest of the economy. Now, we also think that by looking at these examples, you can see that UMP tends to be more effective during episodes of severe financial distress, which is when market segmentation is really at its peak. I think that came across in the case of quantitative easing the first round in the UK, where the movements in financial markets were quite strong. And it was also the case with the OMT announcement in 2012 by the ECB, when at the peak of the euro era crisis, the commitment of the central bank to stand behind the euro and intervene as much as needed to ensure that monetary transmission would essentially operate functionally was quite effective in bringing down sovereign spreads and averting counterfactual, which could have been quite dire. Now, at the same time, we also think that UMP tends to be less effective, and unfortunately much less so, when deflationary pressures are already entrenched in your economy. Japan gives us a clear example of that. It's also much less effective when market participants do not believe about the commitment of the central banks to really stand behind their words. And that is probably the case of the Bank of Japan before the election of Mr. Abe, and it's probably also the case with the ECB at the very early stages of the crisis, where the attention was focused on the LTRO, and there were very severe doubts about the ECB being able to undertake large-scale asset purchase programs, as, for example, the Fed and the Bank of England were doing. Now, in terms of side effects, we also think it's fair to say that no major side effects have materialized, at least not so far, probably with the caveat of the stronger political scrutiny that central banks are being subject to. Now, to some extent, this is a very natural and welcome process that clearly in democratic societies, policymakers, central banks included, are subject to public scrutiny. But of course, we need to make sure that that doesn't feed eventually into threats to political dependence about the operational independence of central banks. That is something that, of course, we want to preserve. Now, in terms of conclusion, our own reading of the literature and perception about the use of UMP is that UMP should definitely remain in the toolkit of central banks because it can provide some important relief if the zero lower bound is ever reached. Now, at the same time, we are also very well aware that UMP should not be treated in a panacea. So there are limits to what can be done through QE. I mean, you can push the yield curve all the way to zero, flatten it all out to the 10-year, but that is sort of a limit, which Japan, unfortunately, has reached. Now, you can think of doing something more with negative interest rates, but also there are thresholds to how much you can push rates into negative territory at the point at which people and institutions will shift toward cash. Therefore, we need to be very mindful of alternative policy tools that can be deployed, especially to reduce the likelihood that the zero lower bound is again reached. This can include fiscal and structural reforms to boost potential growth rate, natural interest rates in the economy, or, for example, higher inflation targets that can, again, provide more room for policy rate cuts in case of a recession. There are also very important open questions that we would have loved to provide an answer to, but are extremely challenging. And so, again, this is definitely a case where more research is needed. For example, are there truly decreasing returns to scale from asset purchases? Are there limits to how much you can do by purchasing assets? Is it the stock or flow that matters? We have these relevant questions about, for example, the persistence of the effects. Is that we need to keep up the flows because the stock is not what drives the impact on yields, for example? Should purchases be restricted to specific asset classes? Or can the central bank actually broaden up its reach and purchase riskier assets? And if so, what is the boundary between monetary and fiscal policy? Let me close up here, and thank you all for your time. We look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for asking me, Don and David. And thank you, too, to the authors of this paper, which is very clear and very comprehensive account of all the unconventional policies conducted outside the US and the major central banks outside the US during and since the crisis. Ken West said he found two sentences in Ken Kuttner's paper he might disagree with. I haven't succeeded in finding a single sentence in this paper. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I will put my own spin on some of this, and in particular try and talk a little about why I think we might expect the effects of QE in particular to vary according to economic conditions and what else the central bank communicates. We've heard quite a bit about this already, and there was an explicit question about it earlier, and I think the answer is that it probably does vary. There are three main conclusions. I'm not going to discuss all the detail in the paper about the nature of the policies that were conducted. For that, I'd recommend reading the paper. It's very clear, as I say. But I'm just going to jump straight to the conclusions. Three main ones the authors give us. First, QE is more powerful in periods of heightened financial distress. I think I strongly agree with that. That's a view that can be justified in theory. Some of the effects of QE, these so-called portfolio balance effects, are more likely to work when markets are functioning less well. And when markets are functioning better, I think the other channel, in particular, the commitment QE involves to keeping monetary policy easy in future, that becomes relatively more important. I'm going to try and give you a couple of more pieces of evidence of that later on, some of which comes from the US, which, as we know now, is engaged in what you might call quantitative tightening. The authors also say that unconventional policy requires that the central bank be credible. That's certainly true. It's true, I would say, of all monetary policy, with a fixed inflation target, certainly. It's particularly true of QE, I think, precisely because it works partly via signaling something about future policy. And as the authors point out, there are limits to our ability to commit, and those limits are particularly stark when we hit the zero lower bound, not just with current spot rates, but in forward space as well. So the particular spins I want to put on it are first to say what everyone else has said, which is we must be modest in our approach to this and in our claims for what we know about QE. We have much more limited evidence than we do for standard monetary policy. As I say, I think the effects almost certainly vary, which narrows even further our ability to say anything. And therefore, I think to hear statements, and I confess that the Bank of England, of course I wasn't there at the time, but Bank of England was amongst those that said this, that X billion of QE equals Y basis points off short rates. These statements are unlikely to be reasonable or valid. This, I think, partly reflects some of the other things the authors talk about, which is the political criticism of QE. And my own view, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, is that under pressure to defend the policy, central banks were perhaps at times a little too precise in their statements about what it did. Equally, I think some of the more extreme criticisms one can easily reject, actually. I mean, there are so many that maybe that's bound to be true of some of them, but still they go on, it seems. And I think one should push back. If ever we're to use this again, it's important that we don't let those stand. Final remark, and I won't talk much about the ECB, but it's obviously operationally and politically more difficult to conduct these policies in a currency union where there's no single fiscal authority. But as we've discovered, and I think this is a good thing, it's not impossible. So let me start with those criticisms. These were ones certainly heard everywhere to varying degrees. It was new and dangerous. As we heard, it was going to lead to very rapid inflation. It didn't help the economy. You know, we still had a recession. We still had a sluggish recovery. And what one heard in particular in Europe was that it served only to subsidize the more profligate governments. And we heard a lot in the UK, certainly, and obviously in this country, is that all it did is push up the price of risky assets, and those are held disproportionately by the well-off, so it worsened inequality. And finally, we heard quite a lot at the time that this is a policy that couldn't be reversed, and that therefore represented monetization. I put that in square brackets because I'd say that's already rejected given what's going on here. It already is being reversed. So I don't think that one's already gone. One very general comment about newfangled, we know that's not true. There's buckets you can read about discussion of what might have been QE during the Great Depression. Friedman and Schwartz, over 50 years ago, argue, perhaps too forcefully, but with some persuasive force, I think, that it would have helped to have done it during the Great Depression, and that the failure of the Federal Reserve then to ease policy sufficiently, including via large-scale asset purchases, was one of the reasons. There are many other differences between the last financial crisis and the one in the Great Depression. I will just pick out one comparison that's quite interesting, which is on the left-hand slide. These are US data. The 0 point in both is the stock market peak, one in 2007 in red, and in blue, the 0 point is late 1929. And for what it's worth, the date at which QE was begun in the United States was also the date of the peak for yields, not necessarily in government debt, but certainly in corporate bonds. In the early 30s, those went on rising even as the economy was collapsing. And as we know, deposits also collapsed, and so did the real economy. I don't want to claim that QE is the thing that made all the difference. Obviously, that's not the case, but I think it is interesting to compare the two. In the paper, there's a summary of some of the studies more careful studies of what it might have done to the real economy this time round. Many of these use the same techniques you've heard about for the US, event studies. Some of them are quite richly identified. They include other asset prices, various sign restrictions. People have worked very hard to try and learn what we can about the impacts. Generally, they're positive. First one I pick out says 1% of GDP of asset purchases increases the level of GDP by 1/4 of a percentage point. The only thing I'll pick out here is that you generally find that those that either look at the whole sample or concentrate on the early part of QE generally find stronger results both on bond yields and on GDP. There is some sense from reading all these papers, and there are many of them, that the effects were more powerful early on. You can clearly see that in reaction of bond yields. In the bank, we used surveys of what people were expecting to try and extract the pure surprise component in QE announcements. But that's difficult to do accurately. What we can say is on the day, the biggest reaction was very clearly in those early announcements in the early part of 2009, a very material decline in bond yields, undoubtedly due to what the bank was doing and what it said it was going to do. When it comes to risky asset prices, however, the effect is much harder to detect, even on the day. There was so much else going on that even during various purchases in that one in the right-hand corner is on March 2009, even as bond yields fell, equity prices declined very significantly. There was news about the banks that came through on the same day, and the Bank of England itself was suddenly more pessimistic about the economy. And there's no real clear pattern here at all, even if you narrow that window to 2 or 3 hours in the effect on risky assets. And overall, if you look simply at the levels of these things, these are just the real price of UK equity prices, at least the prices of domestically focused companies in red, and house prices. There's nothing here, to me, to suggest there's been sort of uncontrollable asset price inflation. If anything, the opposite's true. It's been a period of fairly weak growth. And in fact, equity prices certainly have responded only to the extent that the real economy has done so in the UK. Again, I wouldn't look at this graph and think there's something really weird going on, whether due to monetary policy or anything else, boosting the price of equities. Indeed, you can see that even after the economy began to recover in late 2009, you go through 11 and 12 and equity prices were weak despite a recovering economy. That was very much associated with the Eurozone crisis. And I would point out, and I'll come back to this point later, that the trough here was not, for equities in that little dip in the red line, is not an actual policy measure. It is Mario Draghi's whatever it takes statement. I'll just put down a marker here that is communication. It's not actual asset purchases, and it probably had the single biggest effect of any policy measure, I would say, the ECB has undertaken since the crisis. And indeed, if you look at the overall period and you compare the behavior of bonds and equities, and a previous commentator did this for the US, again, it doesn't come through to me that there's any material shock that's driven equity prices, driven these markets, either before or since QE, actually, certainly in the years running up to the crisis. Here I've expressed equities sort of an inverse sense. That inverted PE ratio is really earnings divided by the overall value of the firm, debt as well as equity. And for the last, I would say, 15 years, what's dominated the behavior of these prices is a negative correlation between these two. Or in other words, you tend to have had events which have driven, when they've driven bond yields down, they've driven equity prices down. Or in other words, yields of equities up. It doesn't look to me as though we've had a sample dominated by shocks, which might include monetary policy shocks, that have driven these things in the same direction, that have tended either to push prices of bonds and prices of equities either up or down. That's simply not the case. And even the big dip in the blue line you see there is, which happens to coincide with QE actually, is more about big write-downs in the banking system. And you can see the Brexit effect at the end. Equities have performed very poorly. Their yield has gone up, but bond yields have not. And the same is true in Europe. Even in the US, where, as we heard, you find more evidence of shocks that have driven these things, these markets in the same direction. Well, the US has behaved quite differently in this respect, actually. But certainly I don't think the evidence says in Europe that there's been some massive effect on the price of risky assets. I really can't see that at all. Why might these effects vary over time? Why might it be the case that QE was more effective early on than later? I shy away from saying there are necessarily diminishing returns. I don't see why that should be the case. But I do think if we think about the way it's meant to work, you might well expect them to vary. The authors point out that in markets that are working very effectively and they're complete and all prices are moving fine and people can arbitrage whatever they want, these big asset purchases shouldn't do anything. There's a well-known paper which is over 30 years old, which mirrors a famous paper in finance. A famous paper in finance says if a company decides to swap some debt for equity, that would do nothing at all under certain conditions. And this paper in the mid-70s said, well, there's a similar argument concerning the balance sheet of the state, i.e. the consolidated balance sheets of the government and the central bank. If you say issue more short-term debt or issue central bank money and buy longer-term government bonds in perfectly functioning markets, that will do nothing at all. And as the authors point out, at least for this channel, for the portfolio balance or for the liquidity effects of QE, you probably need to have some dysfunction, and it's reasonable to think, therefore, that the more dysfunction there is, the more powerful this channel is. And there's certainly no reason to expect that markets have equally functioning behavior over time. During the crisis, it's going to be worse. There's sort of great demand, not to say desperation, for the safest asset of all. It's probably central bank money. And in those circumstances, you might expect QE to be more powerful. Let me give you a couple of pieces of evidence as to why I think, at least for my part, I've become more convinced of that. One involves what we've seen in this country over the last year, more event studies type things. What I've done here in the left-hand panel is to add up all the incremental announcements which began long before the actual contraction of the Fed's balance sheet, going back probably to the beginning of 2017. This is in the middle panel, and I've said, let's suppose we add up every bit of news during those particular days. What's been the total change in US Treasury yields cumulatively in the run-up to the quantitative tightening? And the answer is nothing, basically. The left-hand panel shows you what you would have expected if you'd taken projections of QT, the likely path of the Fed's balance sheet over the next 3 or 4 years, and that's a published number, and you use the same multiple as you apparently inferred from the first phase of QE, and you get a very big number. So I think we should be surprised, or at least we should be surprised if we'd had the prior that there was some fixed translation of asset purchases into treasury yields. We should take note of the absence of any effect over the last year. And I mean, I drew this chart before we've had the sell-off in treasuries recently and the rise in yields. But over that period, there was no move in bond yields and no move even if you focus it on days in which these announcements came through. The other piece of evidence is to take account of what treasuries were doing, even as central banks were conducting QE. So again, if you think of the sort of crudest or simplest description of QE as one involving a transaction within the balance sheet of the state, what central banks are doing is essentially shortening the maturity of the private sector's claims on the state. They're saying, well, we're going to take away some of your longer-term claims, the bonds you own, and instead we're going to give you central bank money. And if that were the mechanism by which it worked, if this portfolio balance effect were the only way it worked, then you might expect actions by treasuries, say, to vary the issuance of government debt, to have similar effects. And you can find some in the literature, but they're generally pretty small. And I point out that in the UK, let me come back to this actually, in the UK, even as we were conducting QE at the bank, the government was lengthening its issuance. This pink line shows you the average maturity of those consolidated claims of the private sector on the state, the central bank and the government combined. So you should find that when you do QE, this pink line falls. That's what should happen, because we're giving the private sector sort of zero maturity assets, and we're buying off them much longer term maturity assets. In the UK, they're pretty long. The average maturity of government debt is 13 or 14 years. And yet, despite the fact that we ended up buying somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of all government debt, the maturity hasn't fallen at all, and that's because in the background, the DMO, which is the agency that issues government debt, was busy lengthening the maturity of its issuance. It looked at the yield curve and thought, well, this is nice and flat, and whether this is the right decision or not, decided to sell much more longer-term debt. And so when I first drew this, I thought, well, maybe I should find some negative correlation here between these two, and I didn't find that at all. And I would point out that the same is true in the US, where the correlation actually goes entirely the wrong way for QE, that here too, the Treasury Department has been massively increasing the maturity of its issuance such that that has dominated the action of QE in terms of the average maturity of the private claims on the state. And I think this is relevant. It's certainly relevant because I've heard soundings, a couple of people saying, well, maybe the Treasury should do QE in future or would have the same effects. I'd only point out that it doesn't seem to, well, at face value it doesn't work, that even as the maturity of the Treasury stock has lengthened very significantly, the yield curve has flattened. So what instead is happening, and what might explain both the absence of the effect of QT on yields, apparently, and also what's going on here. And my feeling is that at least I've become more convinced of the power of the signaling channel, which only the central bank can conduct. I would point out, for example, that whereas during the taper tantrum, and that was the first soundings back in 2013 that the Fed was thinking about possibly starting to slow down asset purchases in that case, this wasn't yet QT, there was no statement sort of mitigating that in terms of what the Fed was intending in terms of future policy. So markets saw this and felt they were learning something about the hawkishness of the Fed. And you had this very big sell-off, because the information markets took from that was, goodness, the Fed is more hawkish than we thought. Even though unemployment is still high, they're thinking of reducing monetary easing and even starting monetary tightening. They brought forward the expected date of the first rate hike, and you had this dramatic effect on bond yields. Compare this with what the chair said when QT was sort of first announced in early 2017. She did precisely the opposite, and she said, look, to the extent that quantitative tightening, that asset sales have any tightening effect on the economy, we are going to counteract that by ensuring that the short rate is lower than it otherwise would have been. So whereas in 2009, in a sense, quantitative easing and its signaling component were used in a complementary fashion, we're buying assets and we're going to signal that short rates will stay low. When you got to last year, they were used as substitutes. It was said, well, look, to the extent that selling assets does anything to the economy, we will counteract that by keeping short rates lower than we otherwise would have done. So you had a very different approach to signaling, and I would argue that is why you had a very different reaction in the Treasury market, and it's at least begun to convince me that the most important part of QE, at least when you're outside times of crisis, is really about signaling, and QE is in some sense forward guidance, unless you're in the middle of the crisis and markets are not working at all. And finally, as I say, I point out that in the Eurozone, I'm not going to talk much, the securities market program was the first thing to try and address some of these fundamental concerns about the existence of the Eurozone. There were some asset purchases then. The really effective thing was Mario's whatever it takes. He didn't actually do anything at all. It's the most powerful 3 words a central banker has ever said, I suspect. Okay, thank you very much.
Seems like it's not. I know. It's like being deaf. Oh man. Give me 1 second. It seems to be stuck.
All right, let me start and entertain you in the meantime. Thank you to the organizers for the invitations. It's an honor to be here, and let me start by saying that I basically agree with most of everything that has been said so far, both on the first paper and on the second paper. I think there is a fair amount of evidence by now that monetary policy, and notice I didn't say unconventional for a reason. Monetary policy has worked, has been effective, and basically it has done what was supposed to be doing, which is to impact financial conditions the way we wanted financial conditions to be impacted. So we got lower interest rates, we got lower corporate yields, higher stock prices, and weaker exchange rates in the countries that were using monetary policy the way it was supposed to be used. Now, this might not work, but I will continue. Now, one problem we have, and it has been said, is how to know whether this change in financial conditions did affect GDP and inflation or not. We cannot possibly know because we don't know what the counterfactual is. But the reality is that if you think about monetary policy as monetary policy, rather than separating between unconventional and conventional, what we had was an easing of financial conditions. So I see no obvious reason to say that an easing of financial conditions had no positive impact on growth and inflation. Now, it is true it was probably more effective when there was financial distress. Well, it makes sense because the level of rates is higher. There is a tightening of financial conditions that you can offset. That's exactly what you would expect also in a normal circumstance. And it's more effective when central banks can credibly commit to provide accommodation. Again, as it was said before, that happens all the time also when you are operating on the short-term rate. I think it's very important that we stress that the undesired effects that everybody was panicking about have not materialized. Inflation has not run up. If anything, it's not high enough. There hasn't been a big increase in fiscal deficits, at least until last year. But during the time when QE and the other policies were in place, what we had, if anything, was too tight fiscal policy. And again, as of now, I think we can argue that there hasn't been excessive search for yield or any of the undesired effects that some people were worrying about in terms of financial stability. Now, the question, and one of the things that I would like to stress here is, should we use it again? And the answer is, at least in my mind, yes. And so what I was planning to do and show you, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to, is to give you a couple of thoughts about what the ECB did, what the Bank of Japan did, how monetary policy really works, putting a stress on what I like to call the insurance channel of monetary policy, and then give you my thoughts about how to do it next time and essentially how to create a monetary policy framework that works for all seasons, when inflation is low, when inflation is high, and when inflation is at the target. Part of it is based on a book I wrote last year on some of these issues that was published by the Peterson Institute. So let me start talking about the ECB. If we can get the charts, I'll show you a couple of cool charts that I think are interesting. But let me just say this. The ECB had two phases in monetary policy. One was passive easing, the other one was active easing. And I think it's very important to stress in terms of understanding whether policy worked or didn't work. So until 2012, basically the ECB was avoiding a tightening of financial conditions by providing endogenous liquidity. If you remember, yes, they cut rates, but basically what they did was to provide LTROs. And so the idea was LTROs are self-absorbing. We are really worried that some of these policies may have an undesired effect. What we are doing here is just provide what the market requests. That's not easing, okay? That's avoiding a tightening. Now, in the meantime, obviously, we had the euro area crisis, and there was a sharp tightening of financial conditions in some countries. And so the ECB had to shift at some point into providing active easing. And that's when Mario arrived and said whatever it takes, and then eventually 2 years later, they cut rates and they decided to do QE like the rest of the central banks. So I think that's important in terms of understanding the impact of monetary policy in the euro area. The objectives were different before 2012-13 and after that. Now, when the ECB finally decided to do active easing, they went all the way. QE was very large. When you think about the ratios to total stock, for example, it was quite large, and it was designed the right way. It was a state contingent. And I will tell you later why I think that's the right way of doing quantitative easing. Now, it was also suboptimal because there were restrictions that were self-imposed. Capital key, the 33%, some of the other things. So even not having euro bonds and even not having a fiscal union, QE could have been done perhaps in a more efficient way. Now, one thing that I would comment and criticize perhaps of the way the ECB did policy is that the ECB is the only central bank that hasn't really changed the monetary policy framework. If you think about the Fed issued a statement of long-term objectives, put a 2% on the inflation target, put symmetric, put balanced way. The Bank of England had an update of the remit. The Bank of Japan changed to the 2 by 2 by 2, even changed from quantities to rates. The ECB still has the same definition of price stability, close but below 2%. And in my mind, that is an issue. I mean, I wrote about it in 2015. It's asymmetric. It creates a bias towards lower inflation rather than towards higher inflation. It may have contributed to anchoring expectations, inflation expectations, a bit on the low side. So this is something that I think when we talk about, and as Ben was saying, at the end of the day, it's all about signaling. This would have been a cheap way of easing policy in a significant way by raising inflation expectations from the point of view of the definition of price stability. that's about the ECB. The Bank of Japan is a very interesting experiment, right? Wow. That's not what I meant, but an interesting experiment. But okay, finally. We got something there. Okay, if you can keep that slide there. Let me show you one thing beautiful.
Does your clicker work?
Let me see.
He's going to advance them, so you're just going to...
Okay, then let's stay on this slide. So if you look at the chart on your left, what I wanted to show in terms of whether the ECB was easing or tightening policy, that is the 10-year interest rate swap deflated by 10-year expected inflation from inflation swaps. So it's a way of summarizing what the stance of monetary policy was in the euro area. The dark blue line that is in the middle is the weighted average of the euro area using the capital key. And you can see that it's essentially flat until it finally comes down after 2012. So that's the stance for the euro area as a whole. Now, there is one interesting thing in this chart when I did it that I didn't expect. The purple line is Germany. The green line is the UK. The red line is the US. So the stance of monetary policy in Germany was exactly the same as in the US and in the UK, even if the ECB was not doing QE, which is interesting, right? So if you think about what is a country that didn't have a country risk premium, what is the kind of policy it was enjoying? It was exactly the same one that the Bank of England and the Fed was delivering. Now, this chart here on the right is what I was suggesting about inflation expectations. This is the term structure of inflation swaps. So on the horizontal side, you have the 1 year inflation 1 year forward, 1 year inflation 2 years forward, and so on, until 9 years down the road. What you see is that the US and the UK are basically stable at a round target. For the UK, it's RPIX minus 100 basis points, essentially. For the euro area instead, you can see that it basically never reaches 2%. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying that maybe this is what close but below 2% inflation does to you if you are not strong and clear about what your objective is. Can we move to the next slide? Okay. All right. The formatting is a bit wrong, but it still helps. I think the one thing about Japan that we have learned is that inflation is not a monetary phenomenon. It's not a monetary policy phenomenon. It's really an economic policy phenomenon. And why do I say that? The key of Japan is the resetting of Abenomics in 2016. Why do I call it resetting? What happened in 2016? 2016 was the moment when essentially fiscal policy took the lead and monetary policy said, I am going to follow and I'm going to support. If you remember, there was a big fiscal package that was published in 2016 by the Japanese government, and it was choreographed. So it was announced the fiscal decision one day and the monetary policy decision the day after. The whole idea was to show we are playing together. So when you are at the zero bound in a situation like that, fiscal policy has to take the lead, and monetary policy, in some sense, has to follow. Or there has to be cooperation, just to call it like that. Why? Because then you focus on the relationship between the interest rate and the growth rate. You try to ensure that R is below G, and you try to reduce the debt overhang effect in an economy like Japan. And that is basically what the Bank of Japan is trying to do. So it's difficult to analyze the Bank of Japan with the same yardstick as the other central banks because they have a different economic situation. Now, I call what they did a modern version of helicopter money. Why is that? Well, they also added an explicit inflation overshooting. What do you achieve with that? You achieve with that the monetary policy support is seen as permanent because you are essentially very far away from your objective. And so by doing this, they provide an insurance on the economic outlook. We are going to be here until we achieve what we want to achieve. And then the third point, and that's what I say is an economic policy phenomenon, you need income policies to make sure that wage growth becomes consistent with the inflation target that you are trying to achieve. And that is why Prime Minister Abe has been involved in the Shunto negotiation trying to raise wage growth. Because otherwise, your inflation expectations are low and you cannot push them up. Now, the final point is they have moved into yield curve control, and I think this is good for the future of central banks. What do you do when you don't have more assets to buy? So we have learned that you target yields. And what we have seen is that it sort of works. works in the sense that they haven't been forced to buy the whole issuance, even when interest rates on a global level have gone up. So I think Japan provides a few interesting lessons in terms of how to do it again if the next 15 years are going to be similar to the last 15. And just to say one thing, Japan has had 0 interest rates since 1995, which means that somebody in its 40s has never seen interest rates that are positive in its adult life. Something I thought about it the other day. Can we move to the next one, please? So how did monetary policy work? And take this as a big picture way of thinking about it, but I think it's perhaps a good way to think about it. Think that monetary policy operates in 2 spaces. One is what we call the growth inflation space, which is what our models tell us. And the other one is risk space, right? Uncertainty. And the objective of monetary policy has been to stabilize both gaps. So the output gap and the inflation gap on one side, and the risk gap on the other side. Think about a Sharpe ratio, or think about a value at risk, right? Ricardo Caballero and some co-authors have been doing some work along these lines in terms of a specific model. So in a normal recession, in normal times, the risk gap is irrelevant, right? There is no too high risk aversion or too low risk aversion. So all monetary policy needs to do is to close the inflation output gap, because we believe and we are confident that the economy is self-equilibrating. In other words, there is a recession, we know the central banks will cut rates, we know potential growth is not changing, we know the inflation target is going to be there. So we can price assets and we can take long-term investment decisions. Now, what happens when you have a large crisis, you are stuck at the 0 lower bound, or you are in deflation and you don't know what's going to happen? Then the risk gap dominates, because we no longer know if the economy is going to be self-equilibrating. This is all of us in 2009, basically. And so in that case, it's very difficult to price assets or to make a long-term investment decision, because you don't know how to forecast the future stream of revenues. So what do you do as a policymaker? You sell insurance on the economic outlook. That is why when QE was defined as just quantities, for example, QE2 by the Fed, didn't really do much. You are telling me you are buying 600 billion of US treasuries, but I have no idea where that takes me. Now, when you move to QE3 and the thresholds, so when you make it a stay contingent and you say, I'm going to be here until inflation is at target and the unemployment rate is where I want it to be, then if I believe you, then I can price assets. I can price the yield curve, I can price the future of growth and inflation, and then I can take long-term investment decisions. So this is key. So the design of policy via open-ended and stay contingent rules with explicit forward guidance, in my view, was the secret to getting out of this, because essentially it was to say, I'm selling you the insurance. Can we go to the next slide? Now, oh, it's coming. Okay. So now, this is where it's interesting. How did it really work? So we thought this would work through the portfolio rebalancing effect, right? That the private sector would go and buy equities and sell bonds because the central bank was buying bonds. Well, look at the chart on the left. Those are the cumulative inflows. This is for the US, into ETFs and mutual funds. So this is basically retail and institutional investors, and the flows that went into bonds and into equities. So what we see is that there wasn't really a rush to buy equities because the central bank was really giving us this insurance. What happened was, look at the chart on the right, we recover risk aversion. That's the PE ratio, right? So at the end of the day, all that monetary policy did was to restore the credibility of the endpoint of the recovery. And so there was a decline in the PE ratio, which if we flip it, is basically an increase in risk aversion. And all we did was to normalize risk aversion to levels that we could consider are normal. Then we can argue until we are blue in the face whether that's normal or not. But the point at the end is that it came back to basically similar levels to where we were before. And I think this is an important message in the sense that if we can stabilize risk aversion, then monetary policy can go back to tweaking the growth and inflation forecast. And then the normal transmission channel of monetary policy is going to work. Can we move to the next one, please? So let me conclude just by giving you what I think should be changed in terms of how monetary policy is done based on everything we have learned. First point, and I agree with the authors, I think central banks should do opportunistic reflation, which is the mirror image of the opportunistic disinflation we had since the 70s until now. Essentially take positive demand shocks and accommodate them. And I could argue that what the Fed has been doing with the recent fiscal stimulus is basically this. Taking advantage of that has lifted inflation and inflation expectations and simply accommodating. Given what we have seen in terms of the behavior of growth, I would say we should redefine perhaps the objective of monetary policy as maximizing growth subject to price stability. And I know this is pushing it a little bit. But basically what I'm trying to say is this. Maybe money is not neutral in the near term. Maybe if there is hysteresis or the risk of hysteresis and the Phillips curve is very flat, the divine coincidence no longer works. And for those of you who don't know what the divine coincidence is, it means that if you achieve price stability, you will achieve output at potential. Well, that may not be true anymore. So you would really want to flip it and say, let me make sure I put output at potential, obviously subject to not breaking price stability. And that's a way of avoiding a weak demand trap. Now, we really have an issue with real-time NIRO estimates. I've been surveying all the central banks, and all of them have reduced the NIRO estimates in the last 3 or 4 years by a significant amount. So again, let's not make the opposite mistake that central banks made in the 70s and 80s. There was an overestimation of potential growth. Let's make sure we don't underestimate potential growth now. Third point, keep large balance sheets, be ready to buy all the assets. I completely agree that this should be done at all times. Now, one thing that is important, there is a political concern about losses. Well, increase capital. That's what the Bank of England has done. So I want to have a central bank that is able to do whatever it needs to do without worrying about what the political reaction is going to be. Fourth point, and it relates to what I meant about the insurance channel of policy. Use cyclically adjusted forward guidance as a way to manage risk-taking. And this is important for today. Why is the Fed today reducing the amount of forward guidance that it's giving? It's not just because we are near R star and maybe we don't know what R star is. It's that if you give less forward guidance, there is less confidence about where the future path of interest rates is going to be and increases volatility, and it reduces the amount of risk that the financial sector is going to take. So this is a symmetric tool. In some sense, it could be the way for monetary policy to address financial imbalances by adjusting the amount of forward guidance that it gives along the cycle. And then my final point, please stop calling it unconventional. There is monetary policy. There is easing, there is tightening. There is nothing unconventional about buying assets or doing forward guidance. But more importantly, calling it unconventional creates a stigma and creates a bias to exit. And we want to avoid those two. So let's just call it, these papers are really good, and I'm really happy that they are called the way they are. But from now on, let's talk about monetary policy. Thank you.
Thank you. We're a little behind schedule, but not so much that we don't have time. So can I invite Stephanie Kirkuyu from the Federal Reserve Board, although she's not speaking for the Federal Reserve Board, I'm sure, to come up and moderate a panel with the authors of all the papers, the international papers. And we'll do this for about 10 minutes or so. And I want to particularly thank Angel for his being able to talk without slides, which, as I've learned, is not something they teach you when you get a PhD in economics.
Okay, so thank you to David and the Hutchins Center for allowing me to participate in this panel. So I'll start quickly by first welcoming Giovanni and Pau, who are Damiano's co-authors here, and I'll toss out a question. So there's a big difference in tone between the discussion of the first paper and the second paper. For example, the first discussion raised the doubt that some of the reaction we see that we were attributing to QE is actually to reassessment of economic conditions, that people are taking some signal from the other commentary by the Fed. And the second paper, the one chart that which they showed the increase in interest rates over the period during which QE is supposed to be suppressing interest rates, is another source of doubt about the effectiveness of QE. So, and in contrast, the second papers, my takeaway was that if there's any criticism, it's that the action should have been earlier and more aggressive, and in the case of Japan, done with more, in a way that they were more credible. So, so I'd like to hear your views on why we don't hear those similar criticisms of foreign QE that we're hearing about the U.S. Was there some difference in the way the QE programs, the way it was implemented, the political concerns? What about it leads the U.S. QE program open to these criticisms that the foreign QE programs don't seem to be subject to? So Giovanni or Pau, since you guys didn't get a chance to talk.
Yeah, just to make sure, we are still speaking for ourselves, not for the fund.
Yes.
I do support the family and need a job. So, I think, well, let me answer the question maybe in two parts. One is maybe we just have either nicer or more group thinking discussions than the previous paper. I do think that if you go to Europe, and I would say especially in Germany, you will find sharp criticism of QE, as sharp, if not sharper, than you find it here. So I think to some extent maybe it's just a random draw, this particular panel, and I don't really see a big difference. There may be an element of the degree of market fragmentation that we did experience in the euro area for a prolonged period of time that allowed conditions in which QE was particularly effective. And in particular, forward guidance and the whatever it takes speech by President Draghi. Beyond that, I personally don't see much of a different climate in terms of how controversial things were. And you just need to read the German press to get enough of that.
I didn't read the paper as saying that, well, there were some common areas, in particular the idea that QE, at least in normal times, is mostly about communication, about the future approach to the central bank was common to both, and I think that's absolutely right. And as far as criticism of the policy is concerned, certainly. I mean, I think if you go to Frankfurt, certainly if you were there in 2012, 2013, I mean, most of the last 6 or 7 years, they don't hold back on it. So, and I think one other thing I'd say about the ECB is it's in a slightly different situation. And it wasn't just the sort of part of the median economy they were concerned with, or the overall rate of inflation. It was the perceived risk at the time that the Eurozone itself would break up. And so both the S&P, but certainly whatever it takes, were in some ways quasi-fiscal statements, that the central bank was ready to, in some sense, underwrite the very heightened risk in the peripheral parts of the Eurozone. And that's one of the reasons that it led to the opposition publicly at the time. And it was very important, I think, for that to be credible, that the statement got backing very shortly after it was made by Angela Merkel, who led the country with the strongest fiscal position. So the ECB's experience has been a slightly different one. As far as the economics are concerned and how it works and whether it works via communication, I actually found quite a lot in common in the two papers, that unless you're in the teeth of a real crisis in which markets are barely working, QE is really about signaling your future intentions as the central bank.
I'd like to add that we talk a little bit about it in the paper, but perhaps Damiano didn't have time. I mean, there's cross-country evidence in the euro area that the effects were quite different in different countries. So certainly QE helped in the periphery of the euro area. But also it's important to stress that no country really, the effects were negative about QE. I mean, you might think that given the way QE was implemented with a capital key and so on, Germany received a fair amount of QE, yet you don't see these negative effects showing up. So at best, QE was neutral, and if there was no financial distress, it didn't do much, but it didn't do harm, and it had large beneficial effects in the periphery, which is where the stress was.
So another tricky piece about estimating the effects of QE is that a lot of these programs were going on at the same time. So each country was likely experiencing positive spillover effects from the QE happening elsewhere. I was wondering if you guys think that those effects were important enough to be really muddying the estimates that have come up with, or if they are that each situation was so unique that it's not an important consideration.
Well, for what the event studies are concerned, this is not really a problem unless the committees were meeting exactly at the same time, and then you don't have a separate window to estimate. So from that point of view, as a technicality, this was not a problem. Obviously, when you look at the real sector effects, then this is a bigger concern, and you want to look at the overall conditions across the world. And I think it's interesting that you're asking it this way, because it goes in the opposite way of the criticism that often we hear that the spillovers were negative, for example, vis-a-vis emerging markets. And let me make one point about that. I think that I don't know how much we cover this in the paper, but spillovers are always there. When you're a large country or a large zone like the Eurozone or the United States, when you conduct monetary policy, you will have spillovers. Whether it's through UMP or through changing the interest rate, you will have them. The only difference may be that because of the depth of the recession, with UMP, we were creating sort of a one-sided bet. So think about carry trade, for example. Carry trade, the worst thing that can happen to you is if your own central bank suddenly tightens and you basically had to cut your position short. When your central bank is telling you, look, for 3 years, the interest rate is going to be at 0. Well, now you can really take large positions on carry. And from that point of view, you would expect spillovers to be larger. Now, this doesn't really show much in the data. But at least from a theoretical point of view, this is one difference you could find.
No, just one comment I wanted to make, adding a bit on this, is that, and if we think about why is the beginning of the runoff of the balance sheet of the Fed not having much of an impact on the long-term rates, is that, we can argue the term premium in some sense is a global phenomenon, right? And so the fact that all the central banks were operating at the same time basically self-reinforced each other, and it was a sort of coordinated action. I mean, the fact that, as I was showing before, German rates, were exactly following the path of the US and the UK. That wasn't by design. That's essentially what global arbitrage does to you. So the market was essentially pricing the bonds of the countries without a country risk that was elevated essentially at the same level.
Should we go to questions? Yeah. Okay. In the light blue shirt.
Why don't you take 2 questions and then let them respond?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Dmitry Pirozhensky. Thank you very much. Very interesting. So my question is kind of just what you were talking about, the spillover effects to emerging markets. I'm wondering if they were different based on from the Fed into these other countries, or if it was just a difference in scale, or if it was a difference in different kind of spillover effects.
Hi, Carl Golovin, domain reference nidealivеson.net. My question is drawn from a book I've recently found, A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind by Stephen Goodson. And he raises the question, in this day and age, does all money really need to be borrowed into existence as credit at usury? Cannot money, public money, enter the economy through the governments of the various countries? And the question in my mind, what percentage of central banks in the world truly have a private ownership component, which would make things like quantitative easing perhaps selectively beneficial to private corporatized interest, versus what percentage of the global central banks are truly owned by their governments and their populations of those countries?
Okay, the first one, yeah. The second one.
I'll take the second one, if I may.
Uh,
So the Bank of England is a public company, state-owned, right, and has been for 70 years. It was nationalised in 1946. One of the trenchant criticisms of QE, as I say, is somehow it's pushed up these risky asset prices and led to inequality. That's simply not true. So inequality in the UK has declined in the last 10 years, whether of income or of wealth. I showed you some graphs on risky assets which show how much they've underperformed bonds. I should point out that to the extent monetary policy supports the economy, and we can argue about that extent, but I'm convinced that in 2009 it was vital. That is a progressive thing to do because the people who would otherwise have lost their jobs are generally the less well off, the less well paid, the young, the marginally attached. So I think there is nothing, basically, that I can see in the evidence, certainly in the UK, and I think in Europe. The ECB recently published a very good paper on the marginal effects of QE on inequality that suggests this was anything other than a progressive thing to do.
Okay, on the issue of spillovers, I think it's pretty well known that the dominance of the US dollar in trade and finance these days, and there's many papers that have been written about it. So, of course, US monetary policy is sort of at the center of the global financial cycle. So, Fed policy has large effects on other countries. Now, the Eurozone understood as countries that mostly use the euro in finance, that's smaller. But a few papers have found effects of ECB unconventional monetary policies on Eastern Europe, for instance, where it's sort of more connected. And there's also been some episodes where ECB quantitative easing has been thought of affecting US interest rates. And recently, when, as Angel was saying, when the ECB launched QE and went big with it, there was some impact on US treasuries because of the different positions in the cycle of the Fed already thinking of unwinding quantitative easing, but the ECB increasing the size of their balance sheet.
So I think the measure of a good conversation is that you wish it could continue, and unfortunately this one will not. I want to thank all our participants and all of you who came and people who watched online. The papers that we referred to are already posted on our website, and as Don said, will be posted on the journal. It will be printed in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, I think, at the beginning of November. And we'll post both the video of this and the slides, especially Angel's slides, on our website. The goal of the Hutchins Center is to improve the efficacy of fiscal and monetary policy and public understanding of it. And I want to thank all the participants because I think we furthered both objectives today. And one final favor before you join me in thanking all the participants, if there are coffee cups or papers at the bottom of your feet, if you put them in the recycling at the back, my colleagues here will greatly appreciate them and won't punish me for going 25 minutes overtime. So thank you very much.